Hey everyone, welcome to Pathways Church. We are glad that you are joining us online. My name is Nick, and I know it is scorching outside today. It is a hot one in the Pacific Northwest, so hopefully you're inside and you have an opportunity to watch this in some sort of relative coolness, because I think it's going to be really hot for most of this week. So stay cool, and thanks for hanging out with us today. Now, if this is your first time finding this particular group of people, we are a church that meets in person in Mill Creek, Washington, but we also meet online because there's a bunch of you who participate in this community through just the online engagement as well. So if this is your first time meeting up with us here, you can find out more about us on our website at findpathways.com, and you can find out a little bit about the words we use to describe ourselves, and you can read up on us there. But the words that we often use just to describe who we are the words cautious and curious, because we're a group of people that are a little cautious when it comes to religion, particularly organized religion. Many of us have seen religion used in ways that harms other people, sometimes even harms ourselves. We've experienced a lot of guilt or other things with religion, and so we find ourselves a little cautious about that. But we're a group that's very curious, and we like to ask questions. And just because we're sometimes skeptical about how religion looks, many of us are very interested in this person, Jesus. In fact, many of us have made commitments with our lives to follow in the pattern of Jesus. And so we're a group that likes to ask a lot of questions, rethink some things that we thought we knew before, but maybe we need to rethink a little bit. And so if you are a person who likes to ask questions, this might be a really, really good group for you as well. Now, just some housekeeping things today as we get going. Billy's going to lead us in a couple songs here, and then we have just kind of a little video interspersed in between. And the whole idea with all this part, you can sing at home if you want to, or in your car, or wherever you are. But the idea is just to begin to move our minds from wherever it is that we've woken up and the thoughts that are going through our head now, to being aware that God is here with us in this moment. And so hopefully through the music, through the video, you will begin to become aware of God's presence, settle your mind down, and be ready to investigate the text with us today. So we are going to be doing some singing here now immediately, and then later we're going to do communion together. So at the end of our time together, we'll be doing some communion. And of course, if you're in person, we have it kind of laid out there for you. But while you're at home, perhaps you've got some crackers or bread or maybe some juice around. And so if you want to pull those things out at any point here as we're going through, you'll be ready for that at the end of our time together. Okay, that's pretty much it. So why don't we get right into the singing? And Billy, why don't you take us away?
Your faithfulness, oh God. You wrestle with the sinner's heart. You lead us by still waters into mercy, and nothing can keep us apart. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. Your love and justice, God. You use the weak to lead the strong. You lead us in the song of your salvation. And all your people sing So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. Hey, your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. Yeah, your grace is enough. Heaven reaching down to us. Your grace is enough for me. Hey, your grace is enough. And I'm covered in your love. Your grace is enough for me. For me. For me. Yeah.
Let us love, comes the invitation from the beloved community. That community following Jesus so long that defined their whole beings by it. Let us love little children. They encouraged each other as if this love was something that was yet unknown and needed to be practiced, like a baby carefully watching the footsteps of others until she finally discovers her own feet can move in this way, wobbly and imperfect, but still walking, still following in the way. Let us love little children, not in word or in speech, but as if our whole bodies are learning this new grace. Let us be bold in learning this new movement, for we will falter, and it won't be perfect, just as we are not perfect. Little children, it will feel new and awkward, and it should. It should feel strange to twist and turn our bodies into love's possibility, to learn how to love in the way of Christ, who is still trying to encourage us to love one another. Let this be what defines us now, in this moment, not so that they will know that we are Christians, but so that we know who that God's love abides. God's love abides in me. God's love abides in you. I am in you, and you are in me, and this changes everything. That is our prayer right now, that we will come to believe enough that God's love abides in us and be so changed. O Christ, may it be so.
I've tried so hard to see it. Took me so long to believe it, that you choose someone like me to carry your victory. Perfection could never earn it. Give what we don't deserve it. You take the broken things and raise them to glory. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you've won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all. Now I can finally see it. You're teaching me how to receive it. So let all the striving cease. Oh, this is my victory. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you've won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all and all and all and all. The one who has conquered it all. Yeah. When I lift my voice and shout, everyone comes crashing down. I have the authority Jesus has given me. When I open up my mouth, miracles start breaking out. I have the authority Jesus has given me. When I lift my voice and shout, every wall comes crashing down. I have the authority, yeah, Jesus has given me. When I open up my mouth, miracles start breaking out. I have the authority, yes I do. Jesus has given me. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you've won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated. By the power of your name, I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you won, I am in the heavenly place, undefeated by the power of your name. I am seated in the heavenly place, undefeated with the one who has conquered it all. I know who I am, 'cause I know whose I am. Hallelujah.
All right, welcome back. And this is a really exciting day because finally we get into the main text of Exodus. This is sort of the big event, the main day. It's sort of the main event, if you will, in the Old Testament. Not just in the book of Exodus, but in like the entire Old Testament. This is an OTF, Old Testament fight main event, okay? There are some big fights in the Old Testament, some big battles, but this is the major event, I would say, in the entire Old Testament, and we finally get to read it today, which is incredible because we spent, like 9 weeks, I think, already in the book of Exodus, and we haven't even got to the plagues yet. So finally today we get to the plagues, and it's almost as we get started on this, I feel like what I should be hearing in the background is, oh, what's that guy's name? You know, he'd always be like, let's get ready to rumble. You know what I'm talking about? That guy who always starts all the championship fights by yelling, let's get ready to rumble. It's like, you know, why didn't we have imaging for that? We should have got some imaging for that. Well, I mean, it's probably copyrighted and Facebook would have blocked us again. But you know the guy I'm talking about, right? The guy that just kind of kicks off these main events. And that's what we have today. The big showdown between God and Pharaoh. This is an epic cage match. And it got me thinking, as I was thinking about like famous fights and stuff, I started thinking about wrestling. And did you know that our very own Billy Pierluisi, our worship leader, is a professional wrestler? I mean, what? Did you know that? He is. He is a professional wrestler. He gets in the cage and he wrestles people. I mean, don't believe me? Here, take a look. Can you believe that? He really is a wrestler. And I mean, he was just taking that guy to town right there. I mean, is that a suplex or a duplex? Or I don't know what these wrestling moves are, right? But Billy is really taking that guy to task. And Billy, though, is not going to be in the ring today. Instead, in the ring today will be God and Pharaoh. And God is really going to take Pharaoh to task. Now, we've been doing a series called The Exodus Records, and the subtitle is Reading History Through the Eyes of Ancient Theology. And basically, what we've been trying to do here is learn how to read the material of Exodus as adults, right? Because many of us are familiar with the Exodus story from, I don't know, movies, cartoons, even Sunday school lessons. But now we want to learn how to read this material as adults because the Bible is adult material and there's all sorts of stuff in there that perhaps you hadn't thought about before, how it was composed, what this sort of is the aim of this material, and in fact, even what it actually says rather than just the pictures that are in your head. And so we've been learning how to read this material as adults. Now, when we last left off, if you remember, our protagonist, sort of the ultimate hero of our story here, Moses, he had gone to Pharaoh and asked that the people of Israel, the slaves, be let go for a 3-day journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to their God, Yahweh. And you'll recall that Pharaoh said, who? I don't know anything about this God. And that doesn't sound like a very good plan at all. In fact, he was so unthrilled by this idea that he actually even makes life on the Israelite slaves much more difficult. And it's almost as if that was sort of the undercard skirmish for this, big heavyweight event, this main event that is yet to come. And so today when we step into it, we leave that little skirmish and I suppose, the defeat that Moses and Aaron and the people of Israel suffer in the undercard game here, undercard match. But now today we get into the main event, and it all starts with a throwdown, which is actually literally a throwdown. Aaron throws his staff down on the ground. It's in Exodus 7. We'll pick up in verse 8. It says, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a wonder,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Then Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and they became snakes. But Aaron's staff swallowed up theirs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Now, this is sort of the undercard, again, of the real match, right? It's sort of that first feeling out moment, the first initial throwdown. And Moses and Aaron performed the sign that actually God told them, as we read earlier in the text. This was a sign to throw the staff on the ground and turn into a snake that Moses and Aaron were to perform in front of the Israelite elders in order to convince them that they really were the emissaries of God, the people that God had sent. But here they use it in front of Pharaoh. And so you wonder, was this the plan all along, to practice on the elders and then use it on Pharaoh? Or is perhaps this, again, a different tradition or telling of the story where the facts are slightly different depending on what region of Israel and the people who remembered this story and how they were telling it. But either way, it's a preview of what we are in for, because it seems like no big deal to us, and it seems sort of random, right? Like just a snake, you know? I mean, what is this about staves turning into snakes? I mean, I guess that's a cool magic trick, but it just seems very random. But it's actually not random, because as we noticed a few weeks ago, the snake was actually an important Egyptian image. The snake represented the power behind Pharaoh. In fact, you're probably even aware of the headdress that Pharaoh wears that sort of looks like a cobra, when it's all flared out. And so it's really, really a symbol of Egypt's power and the power behind Pharaoh himself. And so Pharaoh's magicians are also able to turn their staves into snakes. But we discover at the end of this match that Aaron's staff swallows up all the other snakes. And this is sort of a preview of what is to come here, right? It is an ominous sign if you are Pharaoh, because it means, watch out, Pharaoh, you are going down. And it's now that we get into the real main event. Let's put that graphic back up again. There we go. Moses throwing a haymaker on Pharaoh right there, right? We get into the main event. This is the real match, and this is the section you've been waiting for, the plagues and all of that. And this showdown, it is actually going to last, the first 9 plagues, that's 10 of them, the first 9 really last from chapter 7 all the way through chapter 11. So it takes 5 chapters to unpack all of these plagues. And so obviously we don't have time to read it all. And I guess we could go plague by plague, but we would be in the book of Exodus for the next 5 years, right? So we're going to talk about just kind of some overview of all of these plagues. And so we don't have time to read through 5 chapters of the text, but I want to encourage you to read it on your own. And if you do, you'll read all about the 10 plagues, and they are fantastical scenes, right? Where the Nile River, the most important river that really gives life to Egypt in the area, turns to blood. And frogs jump all over the place, and boils show up on people. And I mean, the kind of stuff that happens in these plagues is so fantastical, it is worthy of any major motion picture, any blockbuster movie that Hollywood could put out. And at this point, as you're reading through this section, it's probably a moment as you're reading the 5 chapters that you can't help but ask, did any of this actually happen? It's a question we've asked before, and it's the question of historicity, which means, did any of this actually happen? And we've asked it before, but there's really no way to read this part of the story and not ask it again. Now, I want to remind you that we've kind of discussed some of this before, and I mentioned that I think that the story of Exodus is based at least on some real events that happened. But now it's being told not as history the way we think of it, but in religious languages and pictures that fit the mind of ancient people. Now, some people say that what happens here is so fantastical that it cannot be true. It can't be real history. Because there's many people who say, well, look, I don't believe in God, and if I don't believe in God, I don't believe in supernatural things. All this miracle stuff you read in the Bible, it can't possibly be true. Now, you probably know me well enough to know by now that that isn't my personal thoughts on things. I do believe in a supernatural God, and I do believe that there's tons of miracles in the Bible that really do happen, and I think they're historically accurate and real. In fact, when I approach the Bible material, I sort of expect there to be miracles, because if there's a supernatural God and he is involved with people, I sort of expect that supernatural things are going to happen, and if they don't, it makes me kind of wonder whether or not this is actually a supernatural God. So I'm not one of the people who thinks that miracles don't happen and so all of this is made up, but I still wonder about the historicity of some of this text, because there's some things in the story of the plagues that frankly just make you go, are we recording history here, or are we doing something else? Now, let me give you a couple examples of some of the things that make you go, as you read through this discussion on the plagues, the story of the plagues in Exodus. Now, the first thing is simply this. If you read through Exodus text from these 5 chapters here that have the plagues from 7 to 11, you're going to read about these plagues, but there is a discrepancy about these plagues. Now, you say, if I was to ask you, how many plagues are there in Egypt? You would say 10, right? I mean, because you just saw the screen that said the 10 plagues of Egypt. But most of you already knew that, right? There are 10 plagues. Of course, the last one, the death of the firstborn, is the most dramatic. Everybody knows this. You say, well, I know that. I watched the 10 Commandments, or I watched the Prince of Egypt. Everybody knows there were 10 plagues. Well, the only problem is it appears that nobody told that to the author of Psalm 78 and Psalm 105, because both of these texts actually discuss plagues. There are 3 places in the Old Testament that describe the events that we're reading about in Exodus. One is actually the Exodus text that we're reading, and then Psalm 78 and Psalm 105 also give their version of the plagues in Egypt. And both of these psalms actually list a different number of plagues, and the order is different. In fact, I've got a handy little chart here. Let me show you. Ooh, pretty chart with colors and boxes, and hopefully you can see a little bit this. But you'll notice at the very top that Exodus 7 through 13 has 10 plagues. That's the number that we're familiar with. Psalm 78, however, only includes 6 plagues, and Psalm 105 has a total of 8 plagues. And you can notice there that they are in different orders. For instance, Nile and rivers turning to blood is the first one in both Exodus and Psalm 78, but it's the second one in Psalm 105. Or if you notice locusts, right? Locust is the 8th plague in Exodus, but it is the 4th plague in Psalm 78. And there's something really interesting about this one, because Psalm 78 says not only was it locusts, but that it was also caterpillars. Psalm 78:46, he gave their crops to the caterpillar and the fruit of their labor to the locust. And none of the other 2 even mention this idea of locusts, of caterpillars with the locusts, right? So we have not just a different number, a different order, but also even some of the details are different. In fact, if you go all the way down to the 10th plague, the firstborn dies, right? The death of the firstborn of those in Egypt. And we notice in the Exodus text that in Exodus 12:23, it describes them dying at the hands of Yahweh, the Lord. The Lord will pass through to strike down the Egyptians. But if you jump to the end of that verse, it says the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you down. And so we get this weird description of a destroyer. We don't know who that is. It appears not to be God himself, but maybe a different agent of some kind that God at least allows to do their work. And Psalm 78 picks up on that by describing it this way. Psalm 78 says, "He let loose on them his fierce anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels," right? Oh, so now here we have identified this destroyer as a company or a group of destroying angels. And it goes on in verse 50 to say that he gave their lives over to the plague. So was it a plague? Was it a destroying angel company? I mean, was it some other agent called the destroyer? Well, in Psalm 105, we have the author of Psalm 105 just saying he, Yahweh, struck down all the firstborn in the land, the first issue of all their strength. So what we're seeing here is that really in these three different accounts, it's not just that they're in different number and in different order, but even the details of who did what is a little bit different. Now, what is going on here? Why is there so much variation in the telling of this story? Well, some scholars suggest that Psalms is actually the older tradition, that it contains an older tradition of the story, and that Exodus comes along and just kind of fills it out and rounds off the plagues to a nice round number of 10, because 10 just seems more complete, and it makes the theological point that God wins completely in this cage match, and that perhaps, as we'll notice here in a moment, that there's some reasons for expanding these out to include an epic battle between the gods. However, other scholars think, that the Psalms is often more poetic, and so maybe in this case, the Psalm writer is really just playing off the older material of Exodus. And I don't know, either is really possible, but when you see this kind of variation in the descriptions and orders and number and all of that, it at least has to make you ask the question, did any of this really happen? Or maybe a better question is, how much of this really happened? Now, there's a few other things that will make you go, here. And here's another one, that each plague in this story matches an Egyptian god. Now, one of the things that makes this battle so incredible to ancient readers is the specific battles that it represents between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. And perhaps you haven't been studying up on the gods of Egypt, right? I mean, maybe you haven't just been studying that in your free time or watching a documentary on the deity pantheon of Egypt. And that's understandable, right? But if you haven't been studying that, then you're probably missing out on just some of the basic references to Egyptian gods that each plague seems to address. Now, for instance, the first plague, as you read through it, is the Nile and other rivers turning, the water in Egypt turning to blood. Now, obviously, this makes the water undrinkable, which is in itself an incredible plague to have happened. But its aim is really at the Egyptian god in charge of the Nile, because there was an Egyptian god named Hapi, and he was in charge of making the Nile overrun its banks and to water the land yearly, and that allowed Egypt really to survive. And Yahweh here is not just turning the Nile to blood, he's really demonstrating his power over this god Hapi, who is an incredibly powerful god in the Egypt pantheon. Now, the second plague is another one that's kind of interesting. The second plague is frogs overrunning the land. And it seems pretty random, right? Like, frogs? We're just going to send frogs all over the land? Why frogs? Well, it turns out that a major Egyptian goddess named Heket was the goddess of fertility. And she had the head of, guess what? A frog. And so this is not something random. This is now a battle over who controls fertility, which in ancient cultures is a very big deal. Now, we could go all through the plagues, but we looked at the first two here. The last two are also very notable. The ninth plague, as you'll recall, is the sun being blotted out. The sun just goes dark. And you think, well, yeah, that would be a problem if the sun just went dark. But as probably many of us know, the most popular god of Egypt, if you don't know any of the other gods of Egypt, the one you probably know, the most popular one, is the god Ra, who is the sun god. And so Ra is the sun god here. He is a hugely important deity in Egypt's list, and Yahweh shuts down Ra in this plague, and that is an intended part of what is happening here. And then, of course, the last plague is the death of the firstborn. And this one also seems strange to us, but the Egyptians had a god of the dead, Osiris. And Osiris is in charge of death, but he's also in charge of giving life. And so what we discover in this final plague, the death of the firstborn, is that Osiris, the one who gives life and brings death, is actually beaten at his own game. Whereas Osiris cannot touch Israel, Yahweh can bring death to the Egyptians. And this is really, once this plague happens, this is the 10 count that knocks Pharaoh out. Now, I know all this seems very strange to us, but ancient people believed that there were gods controlling things like rivers and fertility and the sun and death. And I know we have scientific explanation for these things today, but ancient people did not. And so they had mythological, or a better word for that if mythological sounds too intense for you, the idea of a theological maybe would be a better word here. They had mythological or theological reasons for why everything happened. And it's not unusual then that this story would be told using mythical elements, because it's how they believe the whole world functions. And so this gets us back to this phrase that we have talked about before, mythicized history, which is simply telling an event through the way that the ancient people understood the world, right? Mythicized history, which is different from historicized myth, right? Where you take something that ultimately is a myth, there's nothing true about it, has no historical roots, and you make it sound like history. I don't think that's what this is. I think this is history. There's some root of history here, but it is now being told in mythical or theological terms that have to do with the battle between gods, Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. Now, there's another thing here that will probably make you go, and this is something that I didn't notice until recently, but it's that this entire material is actually arranged in a very specific literary pattern. And if it was historical record aimed at giving an accurate historical record like we find in our history books today, it's hard to believe that it would just so happen to work out in this very intentional pattern. Because what we discover here is that these plagues, right, there's 10 of them, but there's really 3 sets of 3, which equals 9, and then one final climactic plague, the death of the firstborn. And with those first 9, they are broken up into 3 cycles. And I've got another great chart here, because I know that this week you were thinking to yourself, I just wish Nick would show more charts, because I think what we're really missing on Sunday morning is just more charts. And so I have another chart for you, the plague cycle chart. Now what I want you to see here is that the first 9 plagues, right, you can see them. The first 3 are blood, frogs, gnats. The second, flies, livestock, boils. The third, hail, locust, darkness, right? We have first cycle, second cycle, third cycle. They all include 3 plagues, all right? Now, we're going to find a pattern here that plays out in each cycle, and it is very consistent. So in the first cycle, you can see the plagues are blood, frogs, gnats. And then, though, we ask the question, is Pharaoh given a warning? Well, for the blood, the Nile turning to blood, yes. For the frogs coming, yes, he is given a warning. For the gnats, he is not. Okay? Yes, yes, no. Now, if we jump down to the second cycle with the flies, the livestock, and the boils, we see that the warning pattern is the same. And when we get into the third cycle with the hail, locust, and darkness, again, it is the same. He has given a warning for the first, the second, and not the third. Now, if we jump back up to the first cycle with the blood, frogs, and gnats, we ask the question, when is this pre-warning given to Pharaoh, right? Well, in the text, in the first cycle, on the first one, the Nile turned to blood, it says, in the morning they warned Pharaoh about this. And then for the second one, no warning is given, and the third one also. And we have that same pattern play out in cycles 2 and 3 as well. And then if we look a little on the far right of this chart, we ask the question, what instructions does God give Moses regarding his presentation of these things? And in the first cycle, on the Nile turned to blood, he's told to go present yourself, or go stand before Pharaoh. And then on the second one, the language is go to Pharaoh. And then on the third one, there's no mention about what he's to do. He just says, say this to Pharaoh, okay? And that same pattern plays out in cycles 2 and 3. Now, the author has clearly put this together intentionally in these 3 cycles that repeat the pattern each time. And you wonder, why 3 cycles? Why this pattern? Well, there could be a pretty good reason for it. Peter Enns, in his book, Exodus for Normal People, he says, it's common in folklore, for example, for things to happen in 3s for the purpose of intensifying the story toward a climax. Now, what he's saying here is that this is a literary trick for building tension and excitement, right? I mean, movies and books and all sorts of things, when you're trying to build up to something exciting, there's usually kind of a way that you build tension. And this cycle of 3s is a way to build this tension and excitement, because ultimately we are moving towards that final climactic plague, the death of the firstborn. This is a big showdown, and these cycles, this pattern is preparing us for the huge ultimate knockout. Now you can notice within these things, within the cycle, the plagues get more intense, right? In each cycle, right, we see this happening, and so the first phrase is go to Pharaoh in the morning, just kind of while you're there, and then it's go tell Pharaoh now, and then the second time it's like you're still there. It just seems to, you don't need to go anywhere. You're still with Pharaoh. It just happens right on the heels of the last one, and each cycle gets more intense, right? Pharaoh's magicians sort of match plagues 1 and 2, but none thereafter. And Pharaoh begs Moses to stop plagues 2, 4, and 7, and says that he will let them go. And then, of course, he changes his mind once the plagues are stopped. But by the time we get to plagues 8, 9, and 10, Pharaoh doesn't even bother begging to stop them. It appears that he just knows he's overmatched. And plague 6, boils on people's bodies. It only affects the Egyptians, not Israel, which is foreshadowing, obviously, what is to come. So the main point in all this is that this has all been laid out very carefully by the writer or the editors in a literary form, and it seems unlikely that it would have just appeared this way if it hadn't been intentionally thought through. Which actually brings us back to something else that we have to kind of go back in the Wayback Machine for, and that is the final thing that really jumps out of this text, and that is sort of a revisit to the book of Genesis. Now you remember, Exodus is part 2, it's season 2 of the Pentateuch, right? And Genesis is season 1. And really, this material, it all belongs together. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what we call the Pentateuch or the Torah, is really all one comprehensive work. It goes together. They're seasons of the same TV show. And if you can remember back to Genesis, we're getting some flashbacks here. Because if you remember back to Genesis, we looked at the opening section of Genesis for quite a while, maybe longer than we would have liked, right? And we noticed Genesis 1 verse 1 said, in the beginning, or actually it says in a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And so we remember here, God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. And heavens, we think of it as like little spirits floating off when they die or something to a nice, paradise place. But when they thought of heavens, they really just thought sky. And by earth, they probably just meant land. So in the beginning, God created land and sky. And the ancients just assumed this. Like, we like to think that Genesis 1 is all about God unpacking how he created the world. But that's not really what interested the ancient people. What they cared about was not who made the world. They knew that. They just assumed that the gods made the world. What they really cared about was who ordered the world. Who put things in their place and made them work. Why does it rain? Who created that? Why does it sometimes not rain, right? Why does the sun shine sometimes? Sometimes why is it dark, right? They wanted to know who ordered these things in the way that they work. And you'd say, well, we know why that is. The sun rises and sets because, the earth is going around the sun and all that. But they didn't know that. They didn't have science. So they were trying to understand in their primitive way how things functioned. And so the important thing about God was that he created things to function, to work. So in Genesis 1-2, we get the real problem that is to be overcome in what we call the creation narrative. And Genesis 1:2 says, and the earth was without form and void. And you remember, this was the phrase, tohu wabohu, which is just fun to say. Still, I mean, I miss Genesis. Tohu wabohu. It just means formless and empty, formless and void. And what Genesis 1 is really about is not so much how God creates the world. It's about how God solves the problem of tohu wabohu, formless and void. Because remember, God is going to now form this world that's been made and fill it. And so the first thing he does to form it is he separates water, right? He separates, he separates day and night first, right? So that now we have a reason for why there's day and why there's night. And then he separates water, and here he separates sky from the seas. Because remember, they looked up at the sky, they saw that it was blue, and they assumed that it was water up there being held back by some sort of clear canopy, okay? So they're in their mindset, the separating between sky and water needs to happen. And then, of course, separates sea from land, draws the water back to create dry land, right? That is the forming of this planet. And then there is the filling, right? He fills the sky that has now been created, the sea, and the land. And so the whole point of Genesis 1 is a historical account, not of how God made all physical matter. It's really about how he brought order to chaos. And the picture of chaos is water. That is the ancient picture of chaos. And in fact, they call it the waters of chaos. And so God defeats chaos by separating the waters, right? Separating the water from the land. And it is the power of God to create order where there is none. And interestingly, we saw in Genesis that this comes back to play in the story of Noah, because we see that order descends back into chaos, that the waters of chaos return. And that's really the story of Noah, that God floods the earth, or at least Noah's concept of the earth. And God allows this chaos, the waters of chaos, to return. And then ultimately he rescinds the flood, he sends the flood away, and thereby recreating order. And so the power of God is not just that he can order chaos, but that he can also, he can order chaos to return, but also that he can triumph over it again. Okay, so what? What does order and chaos have to do with the book of Exodus? Well, we see it playing out in these plagues. The power shown in the plagues is not just that God can send the plague, which ends up being sort of created order thrown into chaos. It is a suspension of the normal way that things are to work. The order that God had set up has been suspended. It sows chaos back into that particular thing. But it's not just that he shows he can bring chaos, but that he can end it by bringing back order. And it shows that Yahweh is the one who is able to pull all the levers that make everything in life work. Peter N. says it this way: like the flood, each plague is a little pocket of chaos. The created order goes berserk for a time before order is restored. And crucially, God's people are protected from the chaos, and the bad guys aren't. Get it? I mean, God is creating chaos again here and then recreating order. And the point here is that the people in ancient times, as I said before, believed that there were all sorts of gods behind how things work. There were sun gods, and there were moon goddesses, and there were river gods, and there were fertility gods who, made sure that your crops grew, because that's about fertility, and also that you had kids, right? And everything happened because they believed the gods allowed it. And if it didn't happen, well, then it must be that the gods are mad and we need to do something to appease them. And you got to remember that the ancient Israelites here, the people of Israel, they live in this time. They are surrounded by this ethos of how life works, and they believe these things too. Now, I know it seems weird to think, and it's very different than us, because we often think that the Hebrew people were monotheists, right? That they believed that there was only one God. But that doesn't appear to be true. At some point, the people of Israel are monotheists and are today. But for a long time in the Old Testament, they appear to believe in a form of monolatry, which is a belief that there are many gods, but only one is worthy of worship. And that is different from monotheism, this idea that you and I might have today that, well, when you say that there's other gods, they're not really other gods. They're just like false gods in your mind, and you've made them to have some importance in your life, but it's not like there's another deity out there floating around. And so we would think of ourselves as monotheists. But the early ancient Israelites are a part of the culture, and they are monolatrous. They believe that there are these other gods pulling levers. It's just that their God is more powerful, and their God is the one worthy of worship. Now, I don't believe today that there are gods pulling levers on rivers and things like that around us. And probably you don't either. I mean, it's like, why are we having this record-breaking heat streak this week, you know? Was it because we made the sun god mad? No, I mean, that's not why. It's because there is this record high pressure ridge that's developed in our region and whatever else, you know, that meteorologists tell us. You see, when I go to describe why we're having a heat wave, I do it based on my worldview, which is all based around science and how things work. You see, because if I'm going to tell the story today, I'm going to tell it very different than how the ancient Hebrews did, because these ancient people can only tell the story the way they see the world. You get it? And so they tell this story with all these mythological pictures in it, not because God couldn't do these things. Of course God could do these things if he wanted to, but they're telling the story using sort of the science of their day, which is mythology. The way that they understand the world, they're using those terms and those pictures to tell a story about how their God is greater. And that is really the main point of this section, that Yahweh is greater. And if there's a theme text to the plagues section, it's probably Exodus 12, verse 12, where God's talking and says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." And I want you just to look there at that bold part again. It says, "On all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment." Now, notice here that Yahweh doesn't proclaim he's the only God, just that he is the greatest God. And I would contend that the reason it's stated this way is because this is the worldview of the Israelite people. And it's not what I think about the world, but it is how they saw the world. And if we are going to be people who read the Bible responsibly, we need to read the text through their eyes. And this is a pretty good lesson for us to learn today, because what we see in this material of the Exodus story is the people are telling God's story and their story the way that they see it. You see, God allows the people to tell his story from their perspective. And isn't that incredible that when we read the Bible, we read the story of God told through the perspective of people? You see, it's interesting to me. We're all a product of our time, right? And it reminds us that we have a really big responsibility today to tell the story of God in the way that we see it. And you could say, well, the Israelites were wrong. There weren't all these other gods in Egypt. From my perspective, yes. From your perspective, yes. But they weren't wrong. They were just describing the story of God in the language and in the worldview that they understood. And I would contend that we still have to do that today, that the responsibility is ours to imagine and tell the story of God based on how we see things today as well. And it is an incredible responsibility. But it's beautiful because this whole idea of Jesus, right, as God become flesh, the incarnation, God stepping into the human experience, appears to be something that is not entirely new for God, because you could say that the Bible material itself is a form of kind of incarnation light, where God is allowing things, his word, to be communicated, incarnated through the telling of the people themselves. It's cool to think that incarnation of Jesus is not a new idea for God, but just the full expression of the idea expressed through how the Bible came to be in the first place. And so when we say that Jesus is the Word of God, it takes on even more meaning and significance. This morning we're going to go to communion, and we are going to remember the way that Jesus told a story. He told a story using pictures too, right? And he used a piece of bread and he used a cup of wine to represent his body and the blood. And pictures have an incredible way of reinforcing ideas for us and teaching us and moving us. And so this morning, as we go to the table, perhaps around your house, you have some elements and you can use them as a picture to tell the story of God's love again to you. That maybe perhaps you need that story told over and over again to let it sink down into your core, that God loves you. Let me pray for us this morning. God, thank you so much for today. Thank you that we have the opportunity to study this text that's been preserved for thousands of years. Thank you that you inspired it, God, that you inspired this text to come to be through those who told it out loud for generations, to those who edited it together, and that we can read this material and be inspired in the way that you love us, the way that you love, guide us, lead us. And as we go to the table this morning, we're reminded that you are a God that uses these pictures to demonstrate your love for us. Thank you, Jesus, for coming, dying for us, coming back to life, and offering to lead us into a new promised land. We love you, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's go to the communion table this morning.
In the darkness, we were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. To reveal the kingdom coming and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering you saw to the other side, knowing this was our salvation. Jesus, for our sake you died. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. till that soul was moved for good. For the Lamb had conquered death, and the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe. For the souls of all who come to the Father are restored, and the church was Christ was born. Then the Spirit lit the flame. Now this gospel truth of old shall not kneel, shall not fade. By his blood and in his name, in his freedom I am free. For the love of Jesus Christ, who has resurrected me. Oh, and praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. Oh, and praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. Praise forever to the King of Kings. Oh, praise forever to the King of Kings.
All right, thanks, Billy. That was great. Appreciate that, leading us in a time of communion. And before we go here, just want to give you a couple announcements as we are wrapping up. First of all, if you want to give financially, you can do that. There's easy ways to support our church community financially. You can go to our website at findpathways.com/donate, and you can set up a gift there. You can give a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can do that all through our website, or you can also text in a gift amount to the number 84321, and there's a little one-time setup for you if that's the first time doing that. There's a couple things. Obviously, today, people on Sunday, people are meeting in person together. We have an in-person gathering that has happened today. But also, we're going to continue doing this through the rest of the summer. So we're going to continue to meet back in our normal space where we used to meet before. And we'll be singing in there. The sermon will be in there. We have some kind of stripped down kids ministry stuff. And we're just kind of exploring how do we get back together in person. So all through the summer, we'll be meeting together back in our old space, with the exception of one date, and that is the 4th of July. Next week is the 4th of July. And because we know people are going to be traveling and doing stuff, we're not going to have any of our regular gatherings. We won't be in person or online next week. And so hopefully you have a fun, safe holiday wherever you are. And we look forward to getting together back with you after that week. And you can meet us again in person if you'd like to, or wherever else. If you want to join our newsletter, it's a really good way to get the updates on things that are happening. You can do that by either dropping us a message on Facebook, or you can email me. Just send me your email address, say, hey, I want to be on the newsletter, and we will make sure that you get the information that you need about all the things that we are doing. That's pretty much it. We're not going to do an online foyer today because many of us are meeting in person. We'll probably pick that up. We're trying to figure out how to make that happen again as we're just kind of all over the place. And we need, if you are interested in meeting us in person, we need a few people to help do some setup stuff here and there, and you can kind of message to be a part of that if you like. But for those of you who are just staying online, we're just going to try to keep it looking the same today like it normally does, right? So that your experience is exactly the same as it has been on here. Okay, that's it. I hope you stay cool this week. It does look like it's going to be scorching hot for a few days. And so find some place with AC, sleep outside, whatever you got to do to stay cool. And hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay, have a good 4th. Bye.